as well, and put inside. I'm going to take that input out and just put it right there. A little copy and paste magic is what made all of that happen. And of course, I'd like to submit this. So I'll put in an input, type equals submit. And I'll say the value is, we'll do some kind of fictitious saving of that favorites. All right. So, better close that tag. Let's see how this one looks when we run it, and what the benefit is of all these new structural and semantic things. So you can automatically see that watermark in the background, right? That Palermo4.com kind of says, hey, this is how the site could look. I'm going to click Save. And it's saying, hey, no, this is a required field. Sweet. Well, if it's required, I'm going to say, OK, I understand it's required. Now I'm going to click Save again. It's like, no, you must enter a valid URL. It's like, all that out of the box. I didn't have to do any other coding to get that kind of validation done. So if I actually put in a valid website, something like www.codefoster.com, another just shameful plug. Yeah, it's just shameless. So I'll go ahead and click Save. Let's see what happens. Well, what did it do? It actually submitted, right? And now it just reset itself back to the original value. But it did accept, in fact, it liked codefoster.com, FYI. So what do you think of those new semantic tags?
I like them. I think it makes the HTML, cleaner to read and, makes more sense.
Yeah, I agree. So, and the benefit here is that you can use all of this within the context of writing an app, just like we were doing with the website. Nothing changed.
And now we're going to move into a new module, learning about CSS. So just a little bit of background here. CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. And the whole purpose of CSS is to describe the presentation of our HTML. It really describes the presentation of any markup language, XML, XHTML, HTML, any of those, SVG included. But in our case, we're mostly concerned with HTML and some SVG. Now, when we're talking about CSS, we're going to be hitting these points. We're going to talk about the selectors that you use to choose what it is that you're going to affect, and the combinators. I'll get to that in just a second. And then we're going to look at a bunch of properties. The nice thing about learning about CSS is that it's pretty flat in concept. There's not a lot of code structure, hierarchy, or strategy that you need to worry about. It's a really flat language that's just a series of selectors and then a style definition, and we call it a style rule. And there's little more than just a collection of style rules. What it is that you want to affect, and then how you want to affect it. Think about a word processor. You've written a letter to your grandma, and you've got the letter all well composed and edited and everything, but you want to bold some things and indent some things. You want to affect some changes to your letter. The first thing that you do is you go and highlight the area of the letter that you want to affect the change, and then you go hit the bold button or the indent button once you've affected a selection. And it's just the same with CSS3. We want to select some area of our DOM, our document object model, our HTML, and then we want to apply some properties to that selected area. So it's just a collection of selectors and then properties with their values, just a lot of that over and over. So we're going to look at selectors first. Selectors are a way to determine what about your HTML is going to be affected, and there's a lot of different ways to do that. In a word processor, of course, you just highlight it and you affect whatever it is that you've highlighted. I'm going to jump over to Code Show, and I'm going to open the selectors example, the selectors demo. And when I open that, what we have here is just a simple CSS pane with an HTML pane below it, and then the results, the rendered results, in the pane on the right. Okay? So as I enter CSS into this pane, I'm going to see the results of it affect this page. So the first selector that I want to show you is the type selector. Now the type selector refers to the type of HTML tag. So you can see in this example HTML that I have on the left that we've got a number of divs and paragraph tags and UL tags and table tags, lots of different tags in there. And their type is determined by the name of that element, the name of that tag. So if I want to, for instance, change everything in a tag with a type of table, I just type table for that selector. And to see some change there, I'll have to define some CSS property and value. So let's just say color red. We haven't looked at the properties yet, but we'll just say color red, and that'll change all of the text red. Now, notice that the values on the right in the render pane that are red are not just the things directly inside of the table, but it's been passed down. It's been passed down to all of the children of that table. So the 2012 value that's inside of the TD, that's inside of the TR, that's inside of the table, got that red value because it cascaded down to it. Okay? So that's the table. Let's look at a UL. That stands for an unordered list, and I can affect red text in the unordered list in all of its list items by just referring to UL. I could also say LI, and that would do the same thing because it's setting all of the list items to a color of red. So that's how I do the type. The next style selector that I want to show you is class. Now you'll notice in our HTML that we have a couple of divs down here that have been decorated with an attribute of class. And in this case, it just says fancy. Let's go ahead and add two classes for each of those. Let's say that it's going to be fancy and bold. And I want you to know that we can have multiple values inside of a class tag, and both of those classes are going to apply to that element. So for all of the elements that have a class of fancy, I use the fancy selector with a period in front of it to apply that. And now you can see in our render results that both of those divs have taken that style property. They've both gotten the color of red. Let's add another one, and let's say I want to use bold. I'm going to use bold. Now, both the red and the bold are applying to those two divs because I've applied two different style rules, both using the class selector. Now, the interesting thing about the class selector is it begins with that period, but there's an assumption that's being made here. There's a default, and it looks like this. That star is going to result in the exact same thing. It's actually going to behave this way, whether you explicitly put that star there or not. The star is called the universal type selector, and it essentially means all of the types that have a class of fancy, or all of the types that have a class of bold. Okay? So when you are writing class selectors and other types of selectors, and you know that it doesn't proceed with anything like this, just know that type selector is actually there. That's the way it's going to behave. Michael, do you ever actually use the type selector on its own?
Just the asterisk?
Yeah.
No, but I have used, and another example similar to that is that you might want to put the word div or li dot if you just want to have it applied to that class for just that kind of element.
Yeah, absolutely. What Michael is referring to is the fact that before this dot, I can put any type. The universal type selector is the default, but I can put any other type, and so I'm combining the selector here with the class and the type selectors. All right? So that's how you refer to elements in your DOM by way of their type and by way of their class. So let's look at another method. Let's look at referring by ID. Now, the difference between decorating your elements with classes and decorating with IDs is that classes don't need to be unique. It's essentially defining an adjective of your elements. These are the elements that should be bolded or should be fancy, or they're things that describe your elements. But an ID is the identity of your element, and there should only be, it's like Highlander, there should only be one. Only be one, yeah. Absolutely. So let's look at our HTML that we have as an example here and see where we have IDs. We've got an ID of div1 up there, and we also have an ID of lorem down here. Now, if I referred to div, it would affect both of those and more, but I'm going to refer to it by ID by using a hash sign and then lorem. And that didn't affect because I need to start it. I had it started with a space. So I have a hash sign and then the ID, which is lorem, and I'm affecting that with the color of red, and you can see that that took effect in the render panel here. Pretty interesting. Cool. Now, so far, we haven't run into any conflicts that expanded beyond the render panel, but watch what happens if I just specify a type of div. Did you notice that pretty much everything on my screen changed to red?
Yes.
Yeah. That's because of a scoping issue. It really has applied that style rule to all the divs on the page. It doesn't know that I want to talk about just this pane over here. So we're going to get to that in just a little bit. But first I want to show you the attribute selector. So you've seen the type selector, you've seen the class selector, and you've seen the ID selector. But now we're going to look at the attribute selector. Attribute selectors have square braces around them. And the first thing you can do with an attribute selector, is you can just specify the attribute name. So let's go ahead and decorate this table with an attribute. Now, I could choose from some valid attribute of a table, but I can also make up an attribute as long as I precede it with data dash. Anything that's preceded with data dash, so we could make up one like owner. Who owns this table? Well, let's say author. Who authored this table? So we have data dash author. Now this is considered a valid HTML5 attribute because it begins with data dash. You can put anything you want in there, and sometimes that's helpful. So let's call this author P. Smith. That's who authored this table. Okay, that's perfectly valid. Now, in our CSS, the first thing I can do is I can say for any, remember there's an assumption at the beginning here, for any element that has an attribute called data author, I want it to be colored red. And you can see that that change has taken effect in our output panel.
Cool.
Yeah. So I'm not specifying that the data author value has some certain value. I'm just specifying that it actually has a data author element there, that it exists. Remember the required tag? The required tag didn't have to have any value in it whatsoever. So if you wanted to style, for instance, changed from red to orange or something, everything, we don't need that universal type selector, everything that was required, you could do it that way.
Sure.
There's nothing required on my page, but you could use that.
Cool.
Now you can get a little bit fancier in here too. You can say data author not only exists, but it also exactly equals P. Smith. So now whoever authored, whatever tables are authored by P. Smith will be highlighted in red. And you could, for instance, have a different author on a different table and highlight that in a different color. Now notice the table doesn't work if I don't explicitly say P. Smith and get it exactly right.
Right.
But if I say, any table that was authored by Smith, I could use the string, the cash sign and an equal sign to mean it's terminated by or ends with. This is the equivalent of ends with. So any table, actually in this case any element, that has a data author attribute that ends with Smith is going to be colored red now.
That's powerful stuff.
It is. It's good stuff. You could also do a begins with using the caret. And now notice that it doesn't match right now because there are no tables with a data author that begins with Smith. But there is a table that begins with P. Now sometimes you'll see quotes around the value in here. You do have to be careful that if you have this in a style tag, for instance, and it begins with double quotes, that you use the opposite quote sign. And you only need quotes if you don't have any spaces. If I had P space Smith, then I would need quotes around it. But if it's just a single value, then it's fine to do that without the quotes.
Cool.
Now you can also say that it matches any part of it with an asterisk equals. So now anything that contains P. Smith, which P. Smith does, or anything that just contains Smith, or anything that just contains P. So those all match, you can tell because my table is still red. But E, no, that doesn't match. It's nowhere in the author's name. All right?
Yep.
So that is the attribute selector. Now, the last selector concept that I want to show you before we get into combinators, which is also a selector concept, is selector chaining. So far you've seen me apply one selector and the style rule that applies to it. But what I want to do now is I want to apply the color red not only to my table, but I also want to apply it to my lists. So I want to use a comma, UL. That means that I want the text to be red for all of my elements that either match the first selector or match the second selector. And you can make that pretty big if you want. If, for instance, you want to do something to all of your headers, you could use H1, comma H2, comma H3, comma H4, and it would apply to all of those different headers. Now, you do have to be careful when we get into combinators to know that it resets the chaining of the selector string every time you hit a comma. So if, for instance, you were combining a couple of selectors, this prefix does not apply here. This is not the same as applying div to both of those. This is truly just selecting the UL.
So what would it mean, though,